we're now, there we are. We are now being recorded. And so your participation and staying online to watch is in effect your gracious consent to allow us to record this and your participation. I see many of you don't have your faces showing, so that's the way around it. The program tonight will be a presentation by Michael McKenna, and then we will afterwards have a Q&A session where people are invited to ask questions. And then we'll give you a little bit at the conclusion about what to look forward to coming up in future programs. But I think if at this point I can, excuse me, where I try to chew gum at the same time as I get the PowerPoint up. Eureka. Okay. So Michael, I think you're starting first, and then.
Why don't you, are you going to introduce? Do
you want me to introduce you first?
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay. Is this slide okay while I do that, or would you like me to? Okay.
No, that's fine.
Okay, so Michael McKenna has been a student of Japanese language and culture since 1967, when he began an intensive Japanese language course at the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies. He subsequently studied Japanese language and culture at Harvard and Columbia and received a certificate in Japanese from the St. Joseph Institute of Japanese in Roppongi, Tokyo. For the remainder of the 1970s, he lived and worked in Kyoto. Then, a number of years later, he returned to Japan, this time as a business consultant for a 3-year assignment in Tokyo. So certainly few people among us know Japan as well as Michael McKenna does. In 1992, Michael began a formal study of the Omoto Senkei tradition of Chanoyu, the tea ceremony. He has continued these studies after returning to New York in 1994, and recently has received the designation of lecturer from Omoto Senkei headquarters and the tea name Soken. And so we very enthusiastically welcome Michael McKenna tonight for his talk. And if I can just say, it would be best if you don't mind to keep yourselves on mute until we have the question period, just so there's no background noise. Thanks so much. Michael, over to you.
Okay, please do the next slide, please. My name is Michael McKenna, and greetings to all of you. I look forward to meeting in the flesh as the pandemic eases those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting so far. I'm a member of the Ryu Suikai and a student of Omote Senkei Tea. The Ryu Suikai, or the Green Willow Club, is the Hammond's Tea Club. It's named in honor of Mr. Koichi Yanagi, whose name means willow. And it's in honor of his donation of the Ryusui Ken, the Green Willow Tea Room that we enjoy so much at the Hammond. The Hammond Museum is a very special place. It has the beautiful stroll garden. It has a vibrant art gallery, an art club. But for tea people, it's especially special, especially because of the authentic Japanese tea room. And it's doubly unique in the fact that this tea room is open to students of all schools of Japanese tea. We've had events at the Hammond where people from 3 or 4 different schools have presented their own style of Japanese tea, and we hope to do so in the future. A couple of months ago, at the height of the pandemic, we were casting about for a way that we could keep in touch with the tea ceremony. tea meetings, ochakai, even okeiko, keep practice, weren't possible under the COVID restrictions. So what we came up with, what we decided on, was a hybrid program, a program that beginning tonight will continue through the rest of the year on the 4th Tuesday of every month at 7 o'clock, that will each month pick up a different aspect, a different element of the tea ceremony, and talk about what we can learn by looking at the different pieces. Then in the spring of next year, a date to be determined yet, we will meet in person at the Hammond, and our members from different schools will present actual tea ceremonies so that we can all join together and enjoy a cup of tea. Today's episode is an overview and an introduction to the program. In Japan, we call the path to a tea room a roji, a dewy path. And our program tonight is, we at least intended to be, a few stepping stones towards understanding this slightly different way of talking about, looking at the tea ceremony. The tea ceremony is a multifaceted art. Not yet, please. Stick around there for a minute. What is it? I think we should be back. No, that's fine. Yes, okay, move ahead one now, please. In Japan and in England, in English, we talk about the tea ceremony, but the Japanese for the tea ceremony is simpler and even more direct. Cha no yu, hot water for tea. Tea is a drink. The tea ceremony, we'll talk about tea in a minute. The tea ceremony is for first blush, a school of movement and manners. When one begins to study tea, one learns to move within the confines of a small 4.5 mat room, about 10 square feet. One learns how to handle the bowl and the other implements used in the tea ceremony. One learns to respond to greetings and signals from your host and your fellow guests. This is all in the service of creating an expression of hospitality. You learn how to welcome and put guests at ease. But most of all, you learn how to serve a wonderfully delicious cup of tea. In the process of doing that, the student is put in touch with a whole range of Japanese arts. Honsai, the former head of the Ura Senkei School of Tea, called tea a Sogo Geijutsu, a comprehensive art, or a compendium of the arts. And our episodes each month, we will try and pick up one constituent element of Ocha no Yu, the tea ceremony, and try and look at it in different ways so that we get a more thorough view of the ceremony itself. tea is an evergreen bush of the Camellia family, native to South China. Tea has been drunk in China since at least the Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 220 AD. And they found architectural remains and grave sites of tea being offered up with the funerary goods. In myth, the tea goes back even further to 2737 BC, when the Emperor Shen Nung was supposedly in his garden boiling a bowl of hot water to drink, when some tea leaves blew from a nearby plant into his boiling water, and he discovered a wonderful new drink. Certainly by the Han Dynasty, 600 to 1000 AD, very, very roughly, that tea had become the drink of China. And in this Song Dynasty, 10th to the 13th centuries, the variety of tea that was most commonly drunk was a powdered tea, a tea that has, where the leaves themselves have been ground down to a fine powder that's then mixed in a solution with a whisk, as we do in the tea ceremony. It was first brought, that form of tea was first brought to China, from China to Japan in 1191 by the monk Eizai, who had gone to China to study Zen Buddhism. You get a clear idea of the utility that he saw in tea from the title of a work that he wrote called the Kiso Yojoki, Drink Tea for the Health of the Nation. It was the translation of that title. Tea was a medicinal product, an elixir. And about 30 years after he returned to Japan, he became very famous for restoring the health and spirits of the shogun Sanetomo. The story is that he had imbibed too much at a feast and was a bit under the weather, but a cup of tea sparked him right back up. At about that same time, the tea was used by the Zen monks to fight off drowsiness in their meditations. So it's an elixir, something like the Red Bull of the day. At this point in history, the 1200s or so, tea is still a very rare and pricey import. So of course, the 1%ers of the day immediately picked it up as an excuse for entertainment. So the upper class aristocrats and the Zen clergy would gather in rooms, a large room in the various palaces called the library rooms, the shoin. These rooms would be decorated with very expensive antiques from China, imported to Japan, metal bowls and vases, symmetrical porcelain teacups, and myriad scrolls with the calligraphy of famous poets and Chinese historians. This large room, the shoin tea, actually developed into a betting game. People would wager on their ability to identify what field, what plantation a particular tea came from. It's called tocha, very boisterous and extravagant. But then in the 15th and the 16th century, a series of really remarkable men appeared. They intuited that serving a bowl of tea could be much more than just entertainment. That if the host were himself to serve the tea, not just leave it to the servants as the aristocratic practice had been, but if the host himself were to prepare the tea in front of the guests and serve it to them directly, it made much more genuine and heartfelt show of hospitality, and in a way involved a kind of a spiritual self-discipline in the preparation of the tea that wasn't part of the previous large room tea. So these men that we'll look at in just a moment preferred tea to be served and the tea ceremony to take place in what's called a koma, a small room, 4.5 mats room. They preferred much more simplified utensils, and they called this variety of tea wabi tea. Wabishi is a Japanese word that originally meant removed from social intercourse, lonely, far away from the world. It came to denote a very simplified style of tea preparation, often done in small huts in the city, in the garden, and behind someone's palace, that produced a kind of a simplified, a very clean and simple type of tea. Next slide, please. The first of these men was Murata Juko, is the pioneer of wabi tea. Some people call him the inventor of wabi tea. He was a merchant. If you see the image of them to his left side, the slightly curved thing on the tatami next to him is actually a single short sword. As many of you already know, only the samurai could carry 2 swords. The merchants were allowed 1 as a means of self-defense. And that's what Murata Juko was. He was a merchant. He, as a young man, studied tea and became dissatisfied with the large room teas. He supposedly, in conversations with the shogun Yoshimasa, spelled out what he thought the principles for the tea ceremony should be. Shuko Mondo is the name of the book. The questions and answers of Juko. And those principles were wake, sei, jaku. Wa is a word for harmony between the guests and the host, between the host and the implements, the utensils that he is using, harmony among the guests. K, the second of these principles, is a word for respect. So you can't really have a good bowl of tea unless you respect not only your host, your fellow guests, but the implements that are used in preparing that tea. Se is the third of the principles. Se means purity, not hygiene necessarily. It means doing things in such a way that it's obvious that this is not defiled by the dust and the sin and the excess of the outer world. If you do all three of those things, Wake Se, then you will reach quiet, Jaku, quietude, simplicity. All of these things together lead you to a more reflective state. He talked in a famous letter he wrote to one of his students, the Kokoro no Fumi, the letter of the heart. He talked about practice, your exercise and your practice being a spiritual exercise. It's not just doing something external, it's really learning something about yourself in the serving of the tea. And interestingly, when he cast about for how he was going to describe what this wabi tea looked like, he went to the world of poetry and he took some concepts that in the day were the most desirable aspects or desirable characteristics of poetry that he then applied to tea ceremonies as well. Chill, lean, withered. Doesn't sound warm and fuzzy, quite the opposite, but it does talk about the cleanliness and the precision that he was trying for in wabi tea. Next slide, please. The second of our gentlemen is Takeno Jo. He's also a merchant, a businessman. He lived in the town of Sakai, which is near Osaka, port city to Osaka, that had its own very distinct culture, was really, for a time anyhow, run by its merchants, not by the warlords of the day. And prided itself in its own commoner culture, merchant culture. So these merchants were very interested in the tea ceremony and studied with students of poetry as well as students of tea. Jo was a student of one of Juko's students. He was born the same year that Juko died. They didn't know each other, but through the intervening student, they continued to carry on the same type of tea. He built on the Juko's wabi-sabi aesthetics, finding beauty in imperfection and transience. Things are not beauty because they're symmetrical. The slightly different, slightly chipped in some cases, worn in other cases, can also be beautiful. And he used not only Chinese implements, dogu, the utensils, but Japanese utensils, Korean utensils, things that were everyday items that were right at hand, but he incorporated into the tea ceremony. The last line in the slide here, Ichigo Ichie, is a famous motto, if you wish, that tea people to this day use. It means, literally, it means one time, one meeting. But really what it's trying to describe is the totally unrepeatable nature of the present moment. This moment, this meeting that we're having via Zoom has never happened with this cast of characters since the beginning of the world. Even though some of us know each other, this is a unique moment. Until the end of time, it will not be precisely repeated. So every moment needs to be taken care of, shown the respect is one of those characteristics there, showing the respect the time and the group of people deserves. He's the second of our three remarkable men. Could we have the next slide, please? Sen Norikyu is the third of our heroes of tea, if you wish. He's the most well-known. In Japanese, he's known as the saint of tea, Chasei. He studied both the tea from the aristocratic styles, the library showing tea. They use a kind of a shelf called a daisu, brought from China. He studied that and incorporated that into his tea. He also studied the small room tea under Joe. He studied directly with him. Like Joe, he was a merchant. He was from Sakai, so knew well this merchant style of tea. And what he ended up doing was refining all aspects of tea that had existed up to that point. The procedures, the implements, the architecture even of the tea room was drastically influenced by his very unique aesthetic sense. Chinese tea, Chinese taste had gone to metal vases and bowls and scoops, or ivory scoops in some cases. Sen Norikyu used humble bamboo growing everywhere in Japan to create his own vases, flower vases, his the scoops and the ladles to bring the hot water to the tea bowl. He commissioned tea cups, tea bowls from a tile maker, the Raku family, a man by the name of Chojiro. Not the fancy, perfect pottery of the Chinese porcelains, but a rougher, more humble, and in many ways much stronger kind of Raku tea bowl. He changed the architecture and the feel of the roji and the tea house itself, where previously an attendant had held a basin of water at chest high so that the guests could use a ladle to purify his hands and his mouth before entering the tea room. Sen Sen laid that basin down onto the ground with stepping stones in front of it so that the guest was forced into a attitude of humility. He has to squat down to be able to purify his hands and his face, his mouth. And that was an attitude that Sen thought was required to enter the tea room appropriately. He doubled down on that thought by creating a door called a nijiriguchi, which means a crawl-through door, so low and so narrow that everyone literally had to crawl through basically on all fours and thereby bow his head to everyone else in the room, no matter how aristocratic, how highly ranked in daily life he was. Sen had a tremendous sense of aesthetic sense. There's a story that I like very much. There's thousands of stories about Sen no Rikyu. I have 3 or 4 different books of different stories about him. But I particularly like one about an estate that he bought in the city of Sakai, which is a port city. He bought this land right on the bluffs overlooking the inland sea in Japan. And his students were all very excited and waiting to see how he would take advantage of this magnificent view. So when they were invited to a tea ceremony, they were puzzled to find that long hedges had been planted, completely blocking out the view of the tea. What's going on here? Why is he doing this? What happened to this view? But as they proceeded through the roji, the dewy path on the way to the tea room, they got to the basin, the hand washing basin, Tsukubai. And when they squatted down to wash their hands, they realized that there was a gap in the hedge right beyond the basin that gave them a view over this very small basin of water towards the great ocean beyond. Even the garden design is enforcing a kind of attitude that Sen believed was required by the true service of tea. Next slide, please. How did the tea masters of old describe their tea ceremony? This is from the Namporoku, a work that was discovered or perhaps written by one of Sen's disciples and was written about as 1700. Bring in cold water, gather firewood, boil the water, whisk the tea, present it to the Buddha, serve it to your guests, then drink it yourself. This is the teaching of the Buddha, which the monks and founders of all the schools have practiced. Sen no Rikyu says that further details are to be clarified by the insights of his students. Let's just pause to think a bit about the path that we've taken to this very simplified, simplistic almost description of what the tea ceremony is about. There's a Portuguese proverb, apparently, that I like very much. It says that God writes straight with crooked lines. And that's really the case with the history of tea that started off as an imported medicine, an elixir, a stimulant to keep people, the monks, awake for their meditations. Became an aristocratic entertainment and a source of betting and wagering. It goes on to rediscover itself as an expression of hospitality, and even at its most deepest, the spiritual self-discipline. It's quite a journey that we're taking following this tea from China to Japan and down to the present. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in tea and want to learn how to serve it, how to receive it, how to enjoy it, how to serve it, what do? Well, you start okeiko. It's a Japanese word that actually means thinking about the past. But in common practice, what it means is practice or exercises. When you begin studying tea, after there's a brief introduction where some of the handkerchief, some of the cloths, and some of the scoop are briefly introduced to show you how to do the specific movements required. Then the teacher each week will take each student through a practice of the whole tea ceremony. It's a little bit like the whole word method of teaching reading that some of us were exposed to as children. Here at the Hammond, we offer a traditional okeiko instruction. Hara Sensei, who's on our call tonight, teaches classes on Saturdays, but because of COVID, we've not been able to offer this for the last year. That's a great loss because the observation and repetition that are characteristic of okeiko are essential to inculcating the spirit of Ocha-no-yu. So we really look forward to resuming these classes when we can safely gather. What we're going to do in this Elements of Tea program will take a slightly different approach to introducing Cha-no-yu. It doesn't replace okeiko, it's just a different look at it. It's not a whole word style of teaching phonetics, but it's more like phonetics where you break down the words to their constituent elements and then put them back together. Next slide, please. So the Elements of Tea, the tour of Cha-no-yu that we're embarking on tonight recognizes the fact that in the 400 years since Rikyu's time, the further details have grown to encompass pottery, ironware, cabinet work, weaving, calligraphy, bamboo work, lacquer, flowers, so on and so on. And at a time when it's difficult to gather for okeiko or tea gatherings, we would like to explore it a different way by holding up one or another of these elements at a time, then putting them back together when we can gather in the Hammond next year. Next month, we'll look at the roji, the path that leads to the tea house. Hara Sensei and her husband will talk about the scrolls that hint at the host's theme for the day. We'll talk about the procedures, the temai, that differ by time of year and by the implements, the dogu that have been used. Talk about the flowers, the special flowers, chabana, that will be arranged by one of our members. And then in 2020, during the spring, at a time that to be decided, we'll bring our tour to a conclusion when students from the various schools of tea will present Chanoyu on site at the Hammond, and will once again be able to share a bowl of tea. So that's my piece, and I hope it's been interesting and hopefully entertaining as well. We have time now for questions, and I think Liz has perhaps organized a few of those questions for us.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael. That was very informative and very rich. May I ask if any of the audience is a burning question that they are eager to ask? Well, maybe just while you think, one thing that you mentioned, Michael, was there was comments about the different schools and different styles of tea. What actually defines different schools or different styles? What about them is different?
It's a very simple question with a very complicated answer. Sen no Rikyu was forced to commit suicide by one of the warlords that was unifying Japan in 1591, I think it was. His grandson, Sen Sotan, was able to restore, actually his son was able to restore the family a number of years later. They got their lands and their homes and their implements back that had been confiscated. But Sen Sotan, Genpaku Sotan, was determined that the family was never going to be threatened this way. It's never going to be threatened with extinction. So he took 3 of his 4 sons and set them up as 3 different styles of tea. Omote Senkei, the school that I work with, was given the front half of the property. Omote means front, and Sen is the Sen family. Senkei means the Sen family. The back of the property was given to another son, and that was the Ura Senkei. Ura means the back lot. And the final son was given a property around the corner called Mushano Koji Senkei. The 3 Sen schools have very similar ways of making tea, traditions and styles. They have Sen Sotan, in order to give them something, a competitive advantage, allowed them to develop slightly different ways of folding a napkin or ladling in the tea, relatively minor, even though to each of the schools they're important, but minor differences. There are other schools that were started and supported by samurai, where the men will take a posture that looks even much more mannish, if you wish, and I think that, I'm not sure if this is accurate, but I read at one point that there's something like 1,800 different schools of tea. As you know, it's very difficult for a Japanese group to continue on when the individual, the former leader, passes away. His 2 disciples tend to split off and start their own schools at that point, and that seems to be what has happened with tea. Is that an answer?
Yes, definitely. That was quite interesting. Anybody else have any questions? Either about practical matters or historical? Well, maybe this will be kind of in preparation for future events. Are there any books that you would recommend, Michael, both in terms of perhaps classical Japanese books that have been translated into English by some of the great teachers, and then some more modern works that would be maybe modern explanations that you find really useful and or inspiring?
You know, I have spread around my room, because I've been referring to them and preparing this thing, probably 10 books at different places, but to run and dig them out under the piles of other books is more than I could do tonight. I'll be happy to do a little homework, and after next month's session, offer some books.
Oh, that'd be nice. And then maybe even we could later in the year have a gathering to talk about the books or something.
That'll be fun.
Well, shall we go to your Morning Glory slide to conclude? Would that work?
Sure.
Okay, let me chew gum and walk at the same time again. And
no, I can't find it.
There we go. And there we go.
Well, this is one of the more famous stories about Sen no Rikyu. In one of the books that I have here, they told this story, and then at the last line of the story says, and it's not clear that this actually happened, but I'm banking on my Irish background. I argue that if it didn't happen, it should have, you know. So Sen no Rikyu, Rikyu planted some morning glories in his garden in the Roji, and they were fairly rare, apparently imported from China at the time. And Hideyoshi, the warlord, heard about these brilliant flowers and sent word that he wanted to see them. Sen no Rikyu was his tea master. So of course he arranged for a morning tea, which began at that time about 4 or 5 in the morning, to avoid the heat and the humidity of the Kyoto summer. But then when Sen no Rikyu arrived at the garden, he was disturbed to find that all of the morning glories had been ripped out, and there was not a single sign of any of the morning glories. When he entered the tea room, though, he found that that a flower base had been arranged with one morning glory in it. The text here, the story that I copied this from, said that the most beautiful flower, but I don't think it was really the most beautiful flower. I think it was Sen's way of saying that you don't really know a morning glory by looking at a whole bank of them, a whole hillside covered with morning glories. Like you don't really understand tea by drinking gallons of tea. You know a morning glory when you really look at one. And you know tea if you really pay attention to the 3 or 4 sips that you'll have at a tea ceremony. So it says, the Lord and his attendants felt quite refreshed. I hope that they had not only refreshment, but a different sense about the importance and the value of what they were doing there. Amen.
Well, thank you. I agree. If that story is not true, it should be, because it's a great story. Well, Michael, thank you so much for starting this very rich and rewarding program. We encourage all of you to come back a month from now in the evening of June 22nd, which is the next fourth Tuesday, when Lara Netting, who's one of our trustees, and William Jarvis will speak on the Roji. And so we'll then continue this investigation into the elements of tea. Thank you so much, and good evening.
And a final word to any of my listeners today who have an insight into the tea ceremony or in Japan. I would be very happy for any suggestions, comments, criticisms, or opposing views. So send me an email.
Okay. Thank you
very
so
much.
much. Good evening.